So lots of good stuff going on. Dr. Dennis Deruelle is going to join us in just a moment here. Dr. Deruelle is the author of the book, Your Health Playbook. There's a lot going on with your health, and you need a playbook. You need a playbook to keep this virus away from you. You need a playbook to fight it going forward. And more importantly, you need to know what you have to do so that when it comes time for fall, and we will undoubtedly have a second wave of this thing, we need to know, you need to know what you need to do to keep yourself strong and hopefully avoid the second wave of what is a quite deadly virus. Dr. Dennis Deruelle joins us now. He's a physician, a practicing hospitalist, and author of Your Healthcare Playbook, Winning the Game of Modern Medicine. Doc, how are you today? Thanks for joining us on Liquid Lunch.
I'm fantastic. Thanks for having me.
So there's a lot I want to ask you about. I know the key thing you wanted to talk about is, the probability and the, potential outcomes from a second wave of this. Everyone's going to get, it's like anything else in life. When you get comfortable, you get careless, you let your guard down, and whammo, we could look up in September or October and be looking at the same kind of load on our system, couldn't we?
Absolutely. I mean, if we don't learn from what this tragic pandemic has taught us already, then shame on us. So absolutely, we need to be prepared. I don't like calling it a second wave because it's not going to go away. It's like any virus. Once it's in our human population, it's going to be there and it's going to be transmitted just at a lower level during this summer as our cases go down. But it's going to come back up. And it'll probably be in outbreaks. I mean, look at China right now. Harbin, the city in northern China, now they have an outbreak because someone that came from Russia. So that's how it's going to happen. And my concern is also about the flu on top of it. If we happen to have a bad flu season, then that could be double jeopardy for us.
So what does it mean, Doc? Is there any way that there could be a crazy mutation here where the common flu meets up with the COVID-19 and then we have a whole new thing happening to people that we're not prepared for?
Well, I don't think that's going to happen because they're two different viruses. One is influenza, the other is a coronavirus. I don't think they're not going to cross-react, so to speak, or drift. However, I just feel that having a bad flu season in and of itself on top of COVID cases that we will clearly have in the fall, that would be that could overwhelm our health systems. But I feel like what's going to happen in the fall with COVID, we won't have as severe outbreaks as we've already had.
So I wasn't saying that with any medical certainty. I just heard, some of these, what I call Looney Tunes on the left-wing media saying that there could be new mutations and we could be unprepared completely again. So there's no possibilities that the common flu and this virus can cause, some tertiary mutation or anything like that.
No. There are two different viruses, and typically viruses don't change like that. They can mutate on their own, but not really across one another. And if you think about the worst pandemic that we've ever had, in 1918, there was a first wave. It wasn't that severe. And then some people believe their theories that it mutated, got more virulent, caused more deaths. But if you look at the third wave, which was actually in 1919, it was much less virulent and less mortality. So I think with most viruses and epidemics, time is on our side. We will probably have something that does some form of treatment. We will probably have a vaccine before the end of the year. We'll be much more prepared with our testing. We'll be able to isolate cases when we find them. And I think all of that means we'll be much, much better prepared, and we won't see what we've seen in the spring and the fall.
Okay, Doc, I don't know, if you're prepared or if you want to weigh in on hydroxychloroquine. I'm up in the air. Well, I was up in the air, and I understand it's a study, and I know you can't have 100% positive performance in a study because a certain amount of people get placebo, so there's a lot of stuff that's blown out of proportion when they say a French study and 350 people all got better. I know that's exaggerated, but I have, at this point, myself, spoken to doctor, a pharmacist, and 2 family members of different patients who say that they have seen, in certain cases, absolutely tangible positive results from the person declining and then getting hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin and having at least a lessening of the decline. Is there any, I know they use this term anecdotal, but is there any medical certainty that in some small cases it has a positive effect?
There's been many studies, as you've mentioned, but none of them, in my mind, have enough patients and have all the controls that we want to definitively answer it. Here's what I can say. It's worked in some studies. It's not worked in other studies. I don't like the data from the VA when patients were more likely to die on it. Again, not a randomized study. So I think today, with our patients across the country in my practice, I'm not recommending using azithromycin with hydroxychloroquine. I'm saying the data's out on hydroxychloroquine. We got to wait for the New York data, and we'll have that soon. My gut feeling, again, from looking at all the studies, is it's probably not going to have a huge impact, but I don't know yet. So that's really what the data tells us.
Well, I'm not going to name him, but a good friend of mine who I played Little League Baseball with, and I trust him with my life. He's a pharmacist. He owns a compounding facility. And he said to me, John, they've made it so confusing with the different alerts that have come out that pharmacists are afraid to even prescribe this hydroxychloroquine anymore. But he said, look, the active ingredient is, I forget the name of it, but it's the equivalent of quinine. Or some quinine-based compound. And he said, look, I made these lozenges in my compounding facility that have some quinine, some zinc, and a heavy dose of vitamin C. And quinine, zinc, and vitamin C in the right doses should at least help you build your immunosystem. So why don't you try that? And that I have been trying, and so far I'm not positive.
Yeah, I've been taking zinc. So Zicam, everyone knows, has been studied in the common cold, and that's what causes a cold is coronavirus. Vitamin C, the data, there isn't good data on it. There's a little bit from China. But I think vitamin C, I think zinc, most of our patients are getting hydroxychloroquine because the risks are not that great and the potential benefit is there. So it makes sense to use it. But I'll tell you one thing right now is your aerobic fitness. If you were very ill with this virus, your lungs are going to be stressed as if you ran two marathons. So if I had to say anything today to our patients, get out there, get aerobically fit. And if you happen to get this and get it badly in your lungs, you're going to really have a better chance of surviving.
Got it. Now, I want to get your expertise on this because I think Trump gets himself in trouble sometimes by the way he communicates things. And then, of course, anytime he leaves the door open, the left-wing media takes that and extrapolates it to whole new levels of fiction. The other day, the president asked a question, the way I see it and read it, of his experts. Could we try getting heavy-duty light inside the body somehow and disinfect or do a cleansing or a washing? I was talking to another great friend of mine, Dr. Joe Lauro, yesterday, and he's worked with places that do these plasma treatments where for people with certain afflictions, they recirculate their blood out of their system, hit it with UV light and plasma, and put it back into the system. And he says the use of UV light on blood and recirculating that blood through has medical effects. So could the president have been referring to something like that, which is a common practice?
Well, I think it's interesting that actually there's been some trials that use heated vapor for coronaviruses. So, I think that, I just think it's an area, certainly it's plausible to try some of these things. But I just think it's an area where he probably shouldn't get into that to talk about therapeutics because it's very hard to get light all the way down into the small sacs of your lung. And so I think he would be better off just not commenting about that stuff, even though, as you point out, you could really theoretically use some ways to do this that might work. Let's leave that to the scientists, in my opinion.
Okay. And I'm with you on that. And, if you read verbatim the transcript, he said, we'll have our medical doctors look at it. But I think,
Yeah.
in some ways, came into office as an outsider and a businessman. So, he's taken probably a whole bunch, millions of inputs and saying, hey, well, maybe if something like that, and he's asking his experts, I think, we should leave it to the experts, maybe ask them that question in private. But it's not outrageous to think that light inside the body could have some positive effects in a long-term therapeutic way.
Yeah, again, I just think it's better for him to stick to what he knows and then ask his experts. But I think it's interesting. Last night on CNN, I saw them talking about Pepcid or famotidine now. They're doing a trial of that in New York, but I think that was irresponsible. Well, why are you bringing up Pepcid? Now it's very hard to get it in the stores immediately. The shelves have been vacated with it, and a lot of people need it. And I think that we all just need to use a little caution before we bring up something as being promising. And I think that, CNN's doing it as well.
So let me ask you, just as a layman, what is the active ingredient in Pepcid that would make it have some kind of, therapeutic value here?
It's a drug. The main ingredient of Pepcid is called famotidine, and it looks like it might bind a papain protease receptor that would stop replication of the virus. There was some data from China that looked like if you were on it, you had much better outcome. And I'm all for studying it. Don't get me wrong. Pepcid is people take it every day. You can buy it over the counter. Now they're giving it IV in this trial. My only point is that it's too soon to bring it up, and you can see how there's a reaction now. People are going to the store and buying it. And I think that's what we need to be careful about, is this hyper alert reaction. And whether it's our president or whether it's CNN, let's be very measured when we talk about these treatments and cures.
Okay, so I want to ask you this, because I'm hearing all different reports in my community about how it seems. I know one person in particular who went in for an elective surgery a couple of days before the COVID really became a real thing, or we knew it was a real thing. And they gave him a COVID test before he went in for the elective, and it was a negative, okay? He went in, he came home, he had some negative response to something, some procedure they did on his throat, and he passed away, okay? So now 2 days before he went in the hospital for the surgery, he was tested and was negative, okay? And he died after the surgery, okay? And his family ordered a independent autopsy, and he's still negative, but yet his cause of death is COVID-related issues or COVID-related. Are the numbers we're seeing real?
Well, certainly our doctors right now. So if we see a negative test and we think a patient has it, we're not going to count on that negative test. And the reason is that there are definitely false negatives, and you would hate to not treat someone just because of a test result. So I think that there are many, many more people that have had it than we know. There are people that have tested negative that probably still have it because the test is not perfect. It has to be shipped in many cases. It could be the reagents. It could be the way the sample is taken. And so, if this person had tested twice negative, then that decreases the chance. But it's not 100% that they don't have it. The only problem is you're not going to be able to get any other samples in that patient. But we've tested patients that are negative that end up being positive later. And yes, I think many, many more people have it than we know. And we can't trust all of the numbers right now. And I'm also not a fan of saying, oh, if you died at home, we're going to call you a COVID death. I don't believe in that. We need to have good evidence so that our data is more accurate. And I don't agree with some of what New York City is doing with attributing deaths to COVID that are not, possibly not COVID.
Yeah, I think it's strange. I'm trying to understand it. Another number that, I'm a former Wall Street guy, so I kind of always try to find my truth in the numbers. And one thing that I cannot figure out, so as of yesterday, they were reporting like 1 million cases with 57,000 dead. And then this number is perplexing me, 138,000 recovered. So if we had 1 million cases and 57,000 of them died, I'm thinking we have 943,000 recoveries for the most part. And there's some people that maybe they're in the 2-week range. How can we only have a 13% recovery rate and a spot 5% death rate? Where are the rest of the folks?
Well, you bring up a good point. Well, some of those people where they're not willing to call them recovered yet. And that's a fairly big group. I mean, keep in mind that the patients that are in the hospital that are on ventilators, they've typically now been on the ventilator for 2, 3, 4 weeks. And so I think some of these people are still in their illness. But overall, we simply haven't attributed all these people. We can't trace them all down. We know that 80% of people get better from this. And I think the people that are not put in the bucket of improving, they simply haven't had the follow-up to document it, or they've stringently said, you've got to be confirmed that you've gotten over it. So, yeah, we're going to find out a lot more of these patients got better. It's just too soon to call that because it takes, 2 or 3 weeks to really kind of get over this.
What's a good measure in your view to say, all right, hey, May 15th, we're going to start letting 25% of the workforce go back to work. If we don't have any definitive recovered numbers, what's a positive date retroactively that you would feel comfortable saying that we can assume this person has the antibodies and we can let them go back to work? Like a month before? 3 weeks before? What's a good period to say, well, positive here, never reported as recovered, but we're going to make an assumption, based on safety, double the usual period of 2 weeks, 4 weeks, or is it 6 weeks? Like, what lets you be allowed to go back to work safely in your view?
Well, first of all, if you get an antibody test, and there's some very good antibody tests out there, you've seen the data from New York City, from Miami, from California. If you have a good test and you have proven that you have the IgG antibodies, the antibodies that really show that you have protection in most cases, not all, then I think you're fine to go. If you haven't had the antibody test, but you've had coronavirus, then I think that you at a minimum, you need to wait 14 days. So I would say 14 to 21 days is a good time window from beginning to end where you should be able to get out there, unless you've been proven to have the antibodies, which you can now get that test.
Okay, so would it be safe to say if you have an IgG antibody test, you're good to go right away? If you don't have an IgG test, you said maybe 2 to 3 weeks. 4 weeks fair? So you got tested on March 15th. You had a positive test. You went home. You isolated. You self-quarantined. You're free of symptoms now for 30 days since then. Is that a safe amount for people who are antibody positive and no definitive recovery? Is that fair to start with?
That is usually what we're finding is that most people mount their antibody response to this within 3 weeks. So that's kind of where I hedged my bet. If you want to say 4, I think that's fine too. What we don't know, and I was kind of upset that the World Health Organization said that if you have antibodies, it doesn't mean you're immune. That was reckless, and they took that statement back the next day. I think we don't know 100% if you're immune, but if you've got a decent antibody response for most viruses like this, you're going to be immune. So we need to watch that carefully. But I thought it was dangerous to say that you wouldn't be immune.
All right, so let me ask you this. Someone like me, I live in New York City. My studio's in New York City. Right now, I'm quarantined with my studio in my living room in my house, but we're right on Broadway, right behind City Hall, one of the, epicenters of the universe, right? Way back towards the end of January, I'm not a guy who likes to take a day off here and there. I felt really sick, really beat up, sweating at night, freezing, sweating, freezing, to the point where I was thinking, wow, I don't think I can go to work today. And then I said, no, stop. I talked myself into it. And then the next night I had very similar. I was dragging all day. Next night I had the same type of thing, and I kind of powered through it. And this is towards the end of January, so I'm not thinking corona at all back then. So I think I may have had a bout with it, right? I've never felt a reason to go get tested. Do I just go straight to an antibody test, or do I have to get a COVID test first and then an antibody test?
Well, first, so thank you for bringing up the point. It's been in the U.S. well before we knew. Everybody knows we thought the first death was at the end of, unfortunately, the tragic death at the end of February, and yet the first death was really on February 6th in Santa Clara County. And I think we're going to find even earlier deaths that were related to COVID. Boston has just shown in their modeling, based on travel patterns, that when they thought they had one case in early February, it was actually 100 cases in all likelihood. So you probably, there's a chance you had it. Let's put it that way. And by now, you would not test positive for the virus. So you can't look for the virus anymore. You need to get an antibody test. And if you had it, you should show IgG antibodies. And that's the best way to know.
All right, so let me ask you this. Is this antibody test, because I want to go back to work, okay? I want to, when I'm allowed, I want to go back to my TV studio. I want to get off my couch. I want to commute. I want to sit in traffic. I want to smell smog. I want to do all the things I used to do here in New York, right? Is there an at-home antibody test? Do we have to go to Quest Labs? Do we have to ask our doctor for a referral? How do we get an antibody test to have ourselves prepared and in a good position to make the right decision to go back to work?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's probably 90 tests out there. The FDA really opened the floodgates for that so that we could be expedient with getting tests available. However, there was some quality issues. So I'm a little skeptical of the home tests. They haven't performed as well in terms of false positives and false negatives. And if they're not going to really be accurate, then you don't want to use it. So I am recommending, there was a good study that was actually done with some researchers at Harvard and UC San Francisco, where they evaluated the top tests that are out there. And you really should look at that list. You can find that, and it'll tell you which tests are best. But I do know in New York City, Mount Sinai has a very good test. Again, I have no association with them, but I am sticking probably towards major labs like Quest Lab and also major academic centers. That's where I'd be getting my antibody tests. I wouldn't use a home test right now.
Got it. So the way to do it is to call your primary care doctor, tell him that you would like to get a referral. I guess you need a referral with most health insurances to go get a test, right?
Yes.
And then what, 48, 72 hours, they're going to come back to you and tell you if you have them or if you don't.
That's exactly right. And as you already know, 21% of New York City residents actually tested positive for this. In your entire state of New York, it was 13.9%. Miami is 6%. And I've been saying for some time that many more people have it. But this has become a political thing.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, and this is what makes me upset, if you have a political narrative that you somehow want your message to be that this is a much, much, much more deadly virus, then you don't want to hear that there were a bunch of people that had it because it'll reduce that number. And then people are afraid that everyone's going to put down their guard. And so they don't want that message to get out. And I think forget about your narrative. The data is the data. And I get upset when people are just discounting studies because they feel like it's going to reduce the mortality rate.
Got it. I like to dig into these, non-political investigative reporters and stuff. And I have this one woman who's fantastic. Her name is Tracy Beans. She was on last week, 2 weeks ago with us. And she was talking to us when you say, the first case is supposedly in February or so forth. She did a big investigative piece with a lot of documents surrounding it about how a bunch of U.S. military traveled through Tacoma, Washington to Wuhan for these military Olympic Games. And they went to Wuhan where they were held this year, and they came back, and it seemed like the first outbreak was there. And then she traced a trail through a number of different statistical, CDC and others, and she points to a huge spike in November and December across the Northwest, and then starting to go across the country in something I'm sure you're familiar with, the ILI, influenza-like illness. So is there a possibility that this thing was really rattling around in December and January, and doctors just didn't have any frame of reference to call it a novel COVID? Could this thing be around as far back as December in your view?
I think definitely in January. I'm a little skeptical of December in the United States, but I really feel like it definitely early January, and we're going to find out a lot more because now we're going back and we're looking at samples, we're looking at deaths that were way before we thought this was here, and we're finding more. So I'm a little skeptical. December is a little early for me, but like you, a lot of our doctors across the country were saying that people are coming in, they've got a pneumonia, they're testing negative for influenza, they're not getting better, and we didn't know what it was. We were hearing a lot of that in early January.
Yeah, I had one member of my family and one very close work associate who were both admitted to the hospital in December, January time with pneumonia or pneumonia-like flu, and they're both, fairly young, healthy women, and things look grim for a little bit for someone who was otherwise healthy. Now I'm thinking both of those people in December and January were probably facing some kind of exacerbated symptoms from this. So could the herd, when you say 21%, there was a 3.5 plus minus margin of error. So, we could be somewhere as high as 25% or a quarter of the population in here. Wouldn't 50% be like a really good goal to shut down the 1 to 2 and 1 to 3 transmissions? If half the people have it, that should put us on the right path to getting herd immunity. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. So you're quoting that reproductive number. That's the number of people a positive patient would give it to. And that's an important number to follow because if you take 1 minus 1 over that number, as you're doing, then you'll get the herd immunity requirement. And if the R naught for this is 2.2, then we need about 55% of the population to get it to be herd immune. However, if the R naught for this is 3, then we need 66% and so on as it goes up. But I think most people feel it's about 2.3, 2.5 is the R naught, and you're right. Yeah, about 55%.
So, then, if you get to 55, then basically the odds are for people who are not to meet, that's really an outlier. And then right now we were seeing like one person contaminates 3 contaminate 9 contaminate 20, something like that here in New York. So if we get that to 55, then we're under 1, basically. So it's like a 1-to-1 or less. And even for a 1-to-1, you need those outliers in the minority to meet in a none. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And, I saw a great website I can't remember. Sorry, I don't remember it's the person that started Instagram started a great website where they're tracking the R naught by state, and I think it's definitely something to follow. But you're right. Once the R naught is less than 1, then what happens is it doesn't. I can't give it. I'm giving it to less than 1 person, and all of a sudden it really doesn't have a host to infect, and it starts to die off in the population. However, it's not going to go away 100%. Remember, it's probably going to go to a much lower level, and we'll have outbreaks in the fall, as we discussed.
All right, in our last couple minutes here, Doc, and I want to thank you for giving us some extra time today, but this is really, on our show, you haven't been on with us in person, but when we get back to the studio, you got to come down and have a drink with us, because that's why we call it Liquid Lunch. We usually take a little look at the lighter side of things, and we try to put it in regular man terms to the extent we can. But at the real end of all days, when you say the R naughts, that means what the main risk we have is for 2 people that have never been either they may be positive, they've never been tested positive or negative, and they may both be asymptomatic, and then they meet when they're both in the minority. Those are the ones, right, that we need to cut off. We need to get to under 1 so that the exponential multiplier effect comes out of it. That gets us out of a pandemic, right?
That's exactly right. And there's a couple ways to do it. You can get the virus yourself, as we already talked about. I'm sure more have had it than we know. And the other way is if we have a vaccine. Because then you're going to, now if you get it, you'd have a mild case, if that, or not get it at all. And now that infectivity, that number that I can spread it to, keeps going down. And as that number goes down, then there's no population left for the virus to survive in. And that's really what we're chasing now. And I think we will have a vaccine before the end of the year. I know that this kind of vaccine is not that complicated to make. We've been making vaccines like this, and it's just a matter of making sure that it's effective and safe. And I know some companies that were looking at the genome of this virus back in January, to your point. They were already studying this virus in January, and they've gotten a head start. And I think we will have a vaccine before the end of the year.
Tremendous. My final question, because I'm curious about this one. It seems like with certain people, or at least certain communities, this thing was so communicative, like really, really fast, quickly communicative, right? And right. I'm just wondering if, like, I heard of a case where, a family member died not from COVID. They had a small gathering at the funeral parlor with like 10 or 12 people. They had masks. They were socially distant. Post-funeral, within a week, 3 people in the family were positive COVID, and 2 of them died. Okay, 50 and under men died. One's still in critical care, right? So it seems like the first wave of this thing, the virus itself was ferocious. So as you start to get towards that herd immunity with the 25 and hopefully 55%, as it's transmitted to other people throughout the herd, let's call it, does the acuteness of its attackability go down, or it's still the same virus? It's just not communicative as much because less people are already have antigens.
Well, let's break that down in a couple of ways. What we have found out is that early on, in fact, probably 2 days before you're symptomatic, you have a large amount of the virus that you're shedding. So unlike the MERS virus that happened in Egypt, as you got further along in your disease, that's when you had a high amount of virus in your body. This virus is so infectious because early on, in fact, before you're symptomatic, you have some of the highest viral amount in your body, and you're shedding it at that time. And I think that's what made this a problem. So in the scenario that you said, you could have had asymptomatic people there, and early on, they had a high amount of virus that's coming out of their mouth. If it got on someone's hands, doesn't matter if you have a mask, when you take your mask off and you touch your face, that's when you're going to get it. And so the one thing about this virus is that it's very, very infectious. The second thing you brought up is that over time, is the virus going to be less virulent? And as I mentioned, it seems to be, not always, but in a lot of cases, over time, once it's in the human mixture, then it tends to get less virulent, not more. Again, that's what happened in the 1918 pandemic. And so I think time is our friend. I don't think the virus in and of itself will be different than it was in the beginning in terms of infectivity. I just think there's a chance, and I'm praying that there's a chance that it mutates to be less of a virulent virus.
All right. Well, that makes a lot of sense to me. You broke it down fantastically. I want to thank you. And hopefully, as we need to, decipher and translate some more stuff, you'll join us again, Doc.
Anytime, and I'll take you up on coming to New York City when I can. We'll have
Yeah.
that. We'll do the liquid lunch, okay?
Yeah, we need one of them. Thank you very much. That's Dr. Dennis Deruelle.